History remembers kings, prophets, and conquerors, but buried beneath their triumphs lie moments so vile, they tore the soul of humanity itself. From emperors who burned their kin alive, to rulers who made death a spectacle, these are the executions that redefined cruelty and exposed the horrifying limits of power. In the spring of 71 BCE, the Roman Republic celebrated a victory that would leave an unhealing scar on its soul. The rebellion of Spartacus, the gladiator who defied the empire, had ended. For 2 years, his army of slaves had fought legions, shattered columns, and terrified the Senate itself. But when Crassus finally cornered the rebels near the river Salaris, Rome's vengeance became more than a military act. It became a spectacle of annihilation. When the fighting ceased, more than 6,000 captured slaves awaited judgment. There would be no trial, no mercy, no possibility of redemption. Crassus ordered them all to be crucified along the Appian Way, the very road that connected Rome to Capua, the heart of the gladiatorial world where their uprising had begun. It was a deliberate act of psychological domination, a message carved in blood and wood, that no slave would ever again dream of freedom. The crucifixions began at dawn. Workers dug rows of holes on both sides of the road. The condemned were nailed or bound to crude wooden crosses, their bodies elevated for travelers to witness. The sound of hammering echoed across the plains. Some died quickly from shock. Others hung for days, eyes glazed by sun and thirst. Mothers screamed for their children. Men cursed the gods. The smell of blood mingled with the scent of olive trees. For weeks, the Appian Way became a corridor of suffering. Merchants, soldiers, and senators passed between the rotting corpses, forced to confront the empire's capacity for cruelty. Birds circled overhead, tearing at the dead and dying. The wind carried moans across miles, faint reminders that the rebellion's spirit had not yet been silenced. Crassus rode through his handiwork with satisfaction, believing fear was the truest form of order. But Rome's victory was hollow. The very cruelty that secured its dominance also revealed its decay. Those 6,000 bodies were not nameless slaves. They were symbols of humanity's broken spirit beneath the weight of empire. The Appian Way, once a road of progress and trade, became a monument of despair, a graveyard without graves. Years later, travelers still spoke of the stench that lingered, of the crosses that remained standing long after the flesh had fallen away. Some said they heard whispers at night, voices of the crucified carried by the wind. Rome had won, but its triumph was stained with the memory of those who dared to seek dignity. The empire had turned death into spectacle, suffering into order, and silence into law. In that grim procession of death, the Republic revealed its true face: civilization built on terror. The crucifixion of Spartacus' followers was not just an execution, it was a warning to eternity. The message was clear: Rome's roads would forever lead to power, but never to mercy. In the year 415 CE, the city of Alexandria stood as a beacon of knowledge, yet beneath its marble columns, hatred smoldered. Once the heart of philosophy and science, the city had become a battlefield between pagan scholars and the rising tide of Christian zealotry. At the center of this fragile world stood Hypatia, a woman whose mind eclipsed her age. Mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, she dared to teach that reason, not revelation, was the path to truth. But Hypatia's brilliance made her a target. She advised the city's governor, Orestes, who often clashed with Cyril, the powerful Christian patriarch of Alexandria. To many of Cyril's followers, Hypatia was more than a woman of learning. She was a symbol of the old gods, of forbidden knowledge that defied divine law. In whispered sermons and street rumors, she was painted as a sorceress corrupting men's souls. The seeds of her destruction were sown not in debate, but in fear. One day in March, as her chariot moved through the crowded streets, the mob came. They were monks, laborers, and believers, eyes alight with fanatic fire. They dragged her from her carriage, tearing her clothes, beating her as the crowd howled. The library steps, once a place of inquiry, became her execution ground. Stripped of dignity and flesh, she was flayed with shards of pottery and seashells, tools of everyday life turned into instruments of sanctified murder. As her blood stained the marble, the mob's rage only grew. When her body finally fell silent, they dismembered it and carried the remains to the Caesareum, where they burned what was left in a ritual of purification. The flames rose high against the night sky, not to honor faith, but to erase memory. What perished that night was not merely a woman, but an era where thought had dared to question dogma. In the following days, silence enveloped Alexandria. Scholars fled, and the few who remained learned that survival required obedience. The city that had once sheltered the greatest library on earth now sheltered only fear. Hypatia's murder marked the death of ancient philosophy and the triumph of ignorance dressed as virtue. Centuries later, her story would be retold as a warning that when knowledge threatens power, power will destroy knowledge. The hands that once held scrolls and instruments of reason were replaced by fists clutching stones and crosses. Hypatia's ashes mingled with the dust of Alexandria, a grim testament to how civilization can collapse not through war, but through belief turned blind. Her name was meant to be forgotten, but history has a memory sharper than flame. Hypatia remains the ghost of a world that chose faith over wisdom, a martyr not to religion, but to reason itself. In the summer of 1305, London prepared for a spectacle that would feed its hunger for vengeance. The man they called a traitor, William Wallace, the rebel who had defied the English crown, was dragged through the mud-strewn streets bound by ropes. His body was bruised, but his gaze remained unbroken. Years earlier, he had raised the banner of Scotland against King Edward I, winning fleeting victories at Stirling Bridge and Falkirk, before betrayal and exhaustion turned triumph into exile. But England's revenge would not rest with his capture. It demanded humiliation carved into history. On August 23rd, Wallace was paraded through Smithfield, the crowd jeering, the clergy watching in solemn approval. His trial had been a farce. He was not allowed to speak in his defense. His crime was not murder nor theft, but resistance. Before his sentence, the English judges proclaimed the words meant to erase him: hanged, drawn, and quartered. The punishment reserved for traitors of the crown. He was hanged until half dead, cut down gasping, and his body opened from chest to groin. His entrails were torn out and burned before his eyes, an act meant to break not only flesh but spirit. Yet even as his body failed, witnesses claimed his silence defied the executioners. He refused to beg, refused to give Edward the satisfaction of submission. When the axe finally fell, his head was severed and tarred, displayed atop London Bridge for all to see, while his limbs were sent to Scotland, scattered across Stirling, Berwick, Perth, and Aberdeen, warnings pinned to the walls of his homeland. For England, it was the extinguishing of rebellion. For Scotland, it was the birth of legend. The sight of his dismembered remains did not breed fear, but fury. Across the Highlands, whispers spread of Wallace's courage, of a man who fought not for a crown but for dignity. His execution failed to end the fight. It transformed it. Within a generation, Robert the Bruce would rise to achieve the independence Wallace had died for. The cruelty of Wallace's death mirrored a wider truth of medieval Europe. The body had become the canvas of authority. Kings no longer ruled merely by armies, but by spectacle, turning pain into a sermon on obedience. To disobey meant to die in public. Your body remade into a symbol of submission. And this idea, this ritual of horror, was not confined to England. It was a disease spreading through empires, from Rome to Persia to the medieval courts of Europe. Wallace's story was not only of rebellion. It was a mirror to all who suffered beneath the illusion of divine kingship. As his ashes vanished into the wind, Europe marched deeper into an age where rulers wielded terror like scripture. And far to the east, in the lands once ruled by Darius, another act of betrayal would soon be punished with a cruelty so precise it would make even Rome tremble. For treason, in Persia, was not punished by steel, but by the tearing of one's very flesh. When Alexander the Great crossed into the heart of Persia in 330 BCE, he found not just an empire in ruins, but a kingdom devouring itself. Among the satraps of Darius III stood Bessus, governor of Bactria, a man whose loyalty to his king was as thin as the desert wind. As Darius fled east to escape Alexander's relentless pursuit, it was Bessus who betrayed him. Pretending to offer protection, he seized the weakened monarch, chained him, and left him bleeding in a wagon. Darius died calling upon the gods to avenge his name. And vengeance, as Persia would soon learn, came not from heaven, but from Alexander himself. When word of Darius's death reached the Macedonian camp, Alexander's fury turned divine. He declared himself the avenger of the Persian king, the restorer of royal justice. Bessus fled, retreating across the Oxus River into the wilderness of Bactria, believing the vast steppes could hide him. But betrayal breeds no allies. His own men, fearing Alexander's wrath, bound him and delivered him to the conqueror, a gift of loyalty bought with another man's blood. What awaited Bessus was not a swift execution. Alexander wanted an example, a punishment that would echo through the empire's veins. Before a gathered crowd of Persians and Greeks, Bessus was stripped, scourged with rods until his skin split like parchment, and forced to stand before the mutilated body of his king's memory. Alexander accused him not only of murder, but of sacrilege, of defiling the sacred bond between ruler and servant. Then came the order. 2 bent trees were dragged inward, their tops pulled together with ropes. Bessus's arms were tied to one, his legs to the other. The ropes were cut. The trees snapped back to their natural form, tearing his body apart in opposite directions, a brutal act known as splitting the traitor. The crowd watched in silence as his remains fell to the ground, each torn limb a reminder of what awaited those who betrayed power. For Alexander, it was justice cloaked in mercy, a foreign king avenging another to legitimize his rule. For Persia, it was humiliation, the sight of a countryman executed by a conqueror in the name of their fallen monarch. Yet the symbolism ran deeper. The Persians believed betrayal desecrated not only the state, but the moral order of the cosmos. By splitting Bessus apart, Alexander had performed a ritual act of purification, restoring balance through suffering. The desert wind carried Bessus's final cries into silence. His blood soaked into the earth of Bactria, feeding the dust that once bore the weight of kings. The execution marked the end of Persia's independence and the beginning of its absorption into Alexander's dream of empire. But the lesson of Bessus would survive long after the sand swallowed his bones. In every age, power would mask vengeance as justice and cruelty as order. From the banks of the Oxus to the towers of London, rulers would continue to make death their language of control. Far in the west, centuries later, another ruler would perfect this performance, one whose crown glittered above, a queen condemned by her own husband's decree. In May of 1536, the Tower of London prepared for the most elegant execution in English history. Anne Boleyn, once the dazzling queen who had redefined the monarchy, now waited for death in a small stone chamber overlooking the gray waters of the Thames. Only 3 years earlier, her beauty and ambition had changed the course of an empire. She had captured the heart of King Henry VIII, defied the Church, and triggered England's break from Rome. But the same charm that had lifted her to the throne now condemned her in a court where affection was as fragile as favor. Her fall was swift and absolute. The charges, adultery, incest, and treason, were crafted with precision, their truth irrelevant. The king, desperate for a male heir and already infatuated with Jane Seymour, needed a queen's death to sanctify his next marriage. The trial, held in the tower's Great Hall, was a theater of submission. Peers who once bowed before her now called her a sinner. Yet even in disgrace, Anne stood with poise. When asked for her defense, she spoke not as a queen, but as a woman who understood her fate. "I am ready to meet death, and I shall die with a good heart." Henry ordered a French swordsman to be brought to London, an act of cruel courtesy. Unlike the English axe, the sword would grant a quicker death. On the morning of May 19th, Anne stepped onto the scaffold dressed in a dark gray gown, her hair tucked beneath a linen cap. The crowd stood silent, uncertain whether to pity or hate her. She knelt before the executioner, praying softly for mercy, not for herself, but for the man who condemned her. A moment later, the sword flashed and her head fell cleanly onto the straw. For an instant, no one moved. Then, as her ladies gathered her body, a single sob broke the silence. The executioner held up her head before the still air of the tower grounds, and the illusion of royal perfection shattered. The queen who had undone a kingdom was undone by it. Henry remarried within days. Her brother and supposed lovers had already met the same fate. In the eyes of the crown, her death restored purity to the throne. But in the eyes of history, it revealed the darkest truth of monarchy, that love and loyalty were never protection, only weapons waiting to turn. Anne's execution echoed far beyond England's borders. It showed Europe that even a queen could be silenced with ceremony, that power's cruelty wore the mask of grace. Her grave, simple and unmarked for centuries, became a quiet symbol of how tyranny could disguise itself as divine order. And while her blood soaked the tower's stone, another royal woman, centuries earlier in Egypt, had chosen a death not of submission but of defiance. She too faced the end with dignity, a serpent in her hand, her kingdom in ruins, her final act written in poison. In the sweltering summer of 30 BCE, the once golden empire of Egypt stood on the edge of extinction. The Nile flowed as it always had, but its queen, Cleopatra VII, knew her reign had reached its twilight. Her armies were defeated, her lover Mark Antony lay dying, and Octavian, Rome's cold-eyed conqueror, had surrounded Alexandria. In the echoing halls of her palace, Cleopatra understood that the fall of Egypt would not come with fire or invasion, but with humiliation. She would not be paraded through Rome in chains as a conquered queen. If she was to die, it would be by her own hand, and she would not die alone. As the city trembled outside, Cleopatra withdrew into her mausoleum with two of her most loyal servants, Iris and Charmian. These women had followed her through every triumph and defeat, from her days of luxury to her nights of terror. Now they prepared the final ritual, not a royal feast, but a death performed with dignity. Cleopatra dressed in her finest robes of gold and white linen, adorning herself as if for a coronation. She ordered a basket of figs to be brought to her chamber, and within it, concealed by fruit and leaves, lay the asp, the serpent whose venom promised a quiet end. Mark Antony's body was brought to her, still warm with life fading fast. Cleopatra held him as he died, whispering that they would meet again beyond the reach of Rome. When his breath ceased, she turned her eyes toward the horizon. The world outside had already begun to belong to Octavian, but within these walls, time stopped. Cleopatra raised the serpent to her arm. History would claim she smiled as it bit, though none who saw her could confirm it. Iris and Charmian stood beside her, watching the poison darken her skin. Neither fled. Iris, the younger, soon collapsed beside her queen. Charmian, the elder, adjusted Cleopatra's crown before succumbing herself. When Octavian's soldiers finally forced open the chamber, they found three bodies, the queen and her servants entwined in death, faces serene, their garments immaculate. To Rome, it was the end of a dynasty. To Egypt, it was the death of divinity. Cleopatra's passing marked the extinction of the pharaohs, the last breath of a civilization that had ruled for 3 millennia. Yet even in defeat, she denied her conqueror the satisfaction of triumph. She chose her own death, orchestrating it like a ceremony, a final act of power performed through surrender. Her servant's loyalty transformed the scene into something greater than suicide. It became a ritual of devotion, a private rebellion against the world's greatest empire. Octavian ordered her body buried beside Antony's, granting her that last wish, not out of mercy, but calculation. He knew that even in death, Cleopatra's image would haunt him, a woman who turned death into legend. Rome would call her a temptress, a witch, a manipulator. Yet beneath the propaganda, history would remember her not as the slave of empire, but as its equal in defiance. And far across the centuries, in another world consumed by hysteria and fear of heresy, a man would face his death not with poison or luxury, but beneath crushing stones, a simple farmer who refused to bend to his accusers. Where Cleopatra met death as a queen, he would meet it as a commoner, but both would face it with the same unbroken will. The year was 1692, and the village of Salem in Massachusetts lay suffocating under a fog of fear and fanaticism. It began with whispers, a few girls claiming to see spirits in the night, their screams echoing through the wooden homes of Puritan settlers. But soon, whispers turned into trials, and the trials into executions. The Salem witch panic spread like wildfire, consuming neighbor and friend alike. Beneath the rigid faith and hunger for order lay something darker: greed, vengeance, and the human thirst for power disguised as divine judgment. Giles Corey was not a man given to superstition. He was 81 years old, a farmer with a stubborn heart and a fierce sense of justice. He had lived long enough to see men twist scripture into weaponry, and now he saw it again, in the eyes of magistrates and ministers who demanded confessions from the innocent. His wife Martha had been accused of witchcraft, condemned for reading books and questioning the hysteria. When Giles spoke in her defense, they turned their suspicion toward him. In Salem, defending reason was itself a sin. Brought before the court, Giles refused to enter a plea. "If I speak," he said, "you will hang me. If I stay silent, you cannot take my land." His defiance enraged the judges, who saw in him not a frail old man, but an obstacle to their authority. According to law, a man who refused to plead could not be tried, but he could be pressed until he did. Thus began one of the most brutal punishments in colonial history: peine forte et dure, the slow crushing of the body beneath stones. They dragged him to an open field beside the jail. There, on the cold ground, Giles was stripped and laid on his back. A board was placed across his chest, and heavy rocks were set upon it. The sheriff, Thomas Corwin, demanded his plea. Giles' answer never changed. 3 words spoken through blood and dust: more weight. Each time the rocks were added, his ribs cracked like dry branches. His chest heaved, his breath shallow, but he would not yield. Witnesses said he never cried out in pain. Some claimed he looked toward the sky and smiled, as if daring the heavens to take him. The villagers watched in silence, some in awe, others in horror. His resistance was more than stubbornness. It was a final act of rebellion against a system that devoured its own people. For 2 days, the pressing continued. On the 3rd day, with the last stones piled upon him, Giles Corey's chest collapsed. His tongue, swollen from pressure, was forced back into his mouth with the tip of a cane. His last words, according to those who stood there, were the same as before: more weight. When he finally died, the earth around him was soaked with sweat and blood, but the law was defeated. Because he never confessed, his property passed to his sons instead of being seized by the colony. In death, Giles Corey denied his accusers the profit of their cruelty. He had turned silence into resistance, a weapon as powerful as any sword. His wife Martha was hanged 3 days later, her final prayer carried on the wind that blew across the gallows hill. After his death, strange tales spread through Salem. Some said that on stormy nights, the ghost of Giles Corey could be seen wandering the fields, his eyes burning with quiet rage, warning that another injustice was near. Years later, during the chaos of the American Revolution, soldiers claimed to hear his voice, a whisper carried by the wind, a reminder that tyranny always wears the face of righteousness. From the broken stones of Salem to the shattered crown of England and the serpent's bite in Egypt, history's darkest deaths share one truth: the body may be destroyed, but defiance endures. In the mid-15th century, the land of Wallachia was drenched in blood and fear. Between the warring empires of the Ottoman Turks and the Hungarian crown, one man ruled with a hand so ruthless that his name would echo through centuries: Vlad III. Known to history as Vlad Gepek, the Impaler. His reign was a nightmare carved into the soul of Eastern Europe, where cruelty was both weapon and message. To his enemies, he was a monster. To his people, he was protection born of terror. And to history, he became legend, the man who turned death into governance. Vlad's youth was shaped by betrayal. As a hostage to the Ottoman Empire, he had witnessed their methods of punishment, impalement, skinning, and dismemberment, inflicted with methodical calm. When he returned to Wallachia to claim his throne, he brought those lessons with him. To maintain order in a land overrun by corruption, he believed only fear could command loyalty. His rule would prove that belief beyond measure. In 1459, after a band of boyars plotted against him, Vlad invited the nobles to a great banquet at his fortress in Targovekta. The hall shimmered with gold and the scent of roasted meat, a deceptive mask of civility. When the feast ended, Vlad's soldiers surrounded the guests. Some were impaled on the spot, their screams filling the night. Others, including women and children, were marched to the mountains and forced to build his new fortress, Ponari Castle. Few survived. To Vlad, this was justice, purification through terror. But his most infamous act came years later, in 1462, when the Ottoman army invaded his realm. Instead of meeting them in open battle, Vlad waged psychological war. As the Turks advanced through the forests near Targovekta, they entered what would be called the Forest of the Impaled. More than 20,000 corpses lined the road, Ottoman soldiers, prisoners, and traitors impaled on tall stakes, stretching for miles under the sun. Some still twitched, the wind carrying their faint moans. The stench was unbearable, the sight beyond comprehension. When Sultan Mehmed II saw the field, he halted his advance, muttering that one could not take the country of a man who could do such things. Impalement under Vlad was not swift. The stake was greased and inserted through the body, avoiding vital organs to prolong suffering. Victims could live for hours, even days, their bodies slowly sinking down the wooden pole. Vlad saw this as justice made visible, pain displayed as power. His capital became a theater of death, where stakes lined the city walls like grotesque monuments. Travelers described crows pecking at the faces of the dead while peasants passed in silence, too terrified to weep. Yet amid this horror, order reigned. Thieves vanished, merchants traveled safely, and peasants left gold by the roadside unclaimed. One chronicler told of a golden cup placed at a fountain in the capital, untouched throughout Vlad's reign. Fear had become a system, cruelty a form of stability. His rule was both madness and logic entwined. But even the cruel meet cruel ends. Betrayed by his own boyars, Vlad was captured and imprisoned in Hungary for years. When he finally returned to power, his enemies closed in once more. In 1476, Vlad was slain in battle, his head sent to the Sultan, preserved in honey, a final trophy for the empire he had once defied. Yet his legend would not die. The peasants whispered that his soul roamed the forests, feeding on blood and revenge. Centuries later, his story inspired another name, Dracula, the son of the dragon. But behind the myth was a truth far darker than fiction, a man who ruled by terror so absolute that death itself became his language. As the forest of the impaled rotted under the blackened sky, the message Vlad left behind endured, that civilization, when ruled by fear, is only a heartbeat away from barbarism. Rome, 258 AD, an empire glimmering in gold, yet rotting from within. Under Emperor Valerian, the persecution of Christians had reached its cruelest stage. The faith that once hid in catacombs now faced extinction under imperial law. Among those condemned stood a man whose courage would burn brighter than the flames that consumed him, Saint Lawrence, the Archdeacon of Rome. His death would become one of the most haunting acts of defiance in ancient history. A final stand against tyranny carved into the memory of faith itself. Lawrence served under Pope Sixtus II, one of the Church's most revered leaders. When the emperor's edict demanded all bishops, priests, and deacons be executed, Sixtus was among the first taken. As his followers wept, Lawrence walked beside him, pleading, "Father, where are you going without your son?" Sixtus, knowing his fate, replied, "You will follow me in 3 days." It was not prophecy alone, it was a sentence. For Rome would not forgive Lawrence's devotion, nor his cunning act of rebellion. After Sixtus was executed, Valerian's prefect summoned Lawrence, demanding the church's treasures. Gold, silver, sacred relics, all were to be surrendered to the empire. But Lawrence, shrewd and unyielding, spent the next 2 days giving away everything the church owned to the poor. When the prefect arrived, Lawrence presented not wealth, but a group of the city's most wretched, the sick, the crippled, the orphaned. "Behold," he said calmly, "the treasures of the church." The insult struck the prefect like a blade. Humiliated before his men, he ordered Lawrence to be executed, not swiftly but slowly, cruelly, and publicly. His death would serve as a warning to all who defied Rome. The method chosen was as symbolic as it was sadistic: death by fire, roasted alive upon an iron grill. On the night of his execution, Lawrence was stripped and bound to the gridiron, laid over hot coals. The smell of burning flesh filled the courtyard as soldiers and citizens gathered. Witnesses claimed that his body twisted under the heat, yet his faith did not falter. Between gasps, he prayed for the strength to endure, not for deliverance. Then, in a moment that would echo through history, Lawrence spoke words both defiant and immortal. "Turn me over, I am done on this side." Whether those words were truly spoken or born from legend, they carried a truth deeper than the flames, that conviction can outlast pain, that faith can humiliate power. His executioners, unsettled by his calm, added more coals, desperate to break him. But Lawrence's final breath was not a scream, it was a prayer. He died facing the heavens, his charred body a silent sermon against Rome's cruelty. When dawn came, Christians retrieved his remains and buried him in secret, their faith unbroken. The site of his martyrdom would later become the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Rome, one of the 7 great churches of the city. His story spread like wildfire through the empire, transforming a brutal execution into a symbol of eternal defiance. Even centuries later, as empires rose and fell, his courage remained, a flame that refused to die. In Lawrence's death, the Roman world glimpsed a new kind of power, one that no emperor could command or crush. The gridiron became an altar, and the execution ground, a cathedral of suffering and faith. As the fires of Rome faded into ash, his story marked the transition from the age of pagan cruelty to the dawn of faith's endurance. But far from the walls of the empire, another man in Persia would meet his death for a different kind of belief, not for the church, but for equality, and his end would be just as merciless. In the twilight of the Sassanid Empire, long before Islam reshaped Persia, a man rose preaching a doctrine so radical that it threatened the foundation of kingship itself. His name was Mazdak, a philosopher, reformer, and to his enemies, a heretic. In a kingdom built on hierarchy, he dared to preach equality, that wealth, power, and even family ties should be shared among all. For the poor, Mazdak was a prophet. For the nobility, he was an infection that had to be cut out with fire and iron. Mazdak's movement began in the late 5th century. Under King Kavad I, a ruler desperate to strengthen his throne amid corruption and famine. The empire's elites hoarded food and land while peasants starved in the streets. Mazdak's teachings offered a new order, one where greed was sin, possessions were communal, and compassion was law. For a time, Kavad supported him, using his reforms to weaken the power of nobles and priests. Grain stores were opened, wealth redistributed, and the old Zoroastrian clergy stripped of privilege. But the fire of justice Mazdak lit soon burned too wildly to be controlled. His doctrine reached into every forbidden corner of Persian life. He preached that women should not be treated as property, that men should not hoard wives or servants, and that violence could only be answered with mercy. To the nobles, these were not holy words, they were heresy cloaked in righteousness. Whispers of social collapse began to spread, and soon, the empire's ancient order struck back. When Kavad's son, Khosrow I, ascended the throne, he vowed to erase Mazdak and his teachings forever. Khosrow invited Mazdak and hundreds of his followers to the royal court, pretending reconciliation. The philosopher arrived in Ctesiphon, dressed in humble robes, believing the new king sought understanding. But the moment he entered the palace courtyard, he saw what awaited: pits dug into the ground, sharpened stakes glinting beneath the sun. The courtiers watched in silence as soldiers seized Mazdak and his disciples. Their robes of peace were torn away, their eyes forced to witness the punishment to come. According to chroniclers, Mazdak was impaled alive before the court, his body raised above his followers, a grotesque symbol of the price of defiance. Around him, his supporters met the same fate, creating a forest of corpses within the palace garden. The ground turned black with blood, the air thick with the cries of those who had once believed in mercy. Khosrow stood among them, his face unmoved, declaring that order had been restored, that heresy had been buried beneath Persian soil. But death did not silence Mazdak. His ideas, though scorched by the empire, continued to haunt Persian thought for centuries. His call for equality would echo through later sects, from the Kuramites to revolutionary poets who dared to speak against kings. Even in the dark chambers of medieval chronicles, his name was whispered with a strange mixture of horror and admiration. Mazdak's end was not just the death of a man, but the triumph of hierarchy over compassion, of empire over empathy. His body may have hung from an iron spike, but his words, "All men are born of the same light," outlived the flames. The iron crown that crushed him was not made of metal, but of pride and power, the same forces that have forever ruled the fates of those who dream of justice. Thus, from the crosses of Rome to the stakes of Persia, humanity's history of cruelty closes its circle, a tale not only of how men die, but of what they die for. And as the last fires of the ancient world dim, they leave behind one eternal truth, that the most dangerous idea in history is not hate, but hope. Across empires and centuries, from Rome's burning altars to Persia's fields of death, these executions reveal the darkest mirror of humanity, where faith, fear, and power twisted life into spectacle. Each victim, whether a rebel, a heretic, or a saint, was crushed beneath the machinery of belief and control. Yet their agony was not in vain. Their deaths carved warnings into history's stone, that cruelty disguised as justice is the oldest sin of all. As the fires fade and the ashes settle, one truth remains: civilizations rise on ideals, but they fall on the weight of their own inhumanity.